The Iberian Peninsula is home to 5 countries. Spain, the one you know about, Portugal, the one you were pretty confident in, Andorra, the one you might have heard of on Trivia Night, as well as France and Britain, both of whom are only here by cheating. However, there have been numerous attempts to unite the various states and empires, the most famous of which, of course, is the Iberian Union in the 1600s, and the numerous kingdoms all trying to conquer each other during the mess that was the Reconquista. However, there was another attempt during the 1490s, wherein the Hieress of Castile, Isabella, and the King of Portugal, Manuel I, were married. Their son, Miguel da Paz, would have inherited both, and with the unfortunate passing of his mother, his claim to Spain was assured. However, the prince died when he was but a toddler. However, the fact of it is he was the best chance to unite all of Iberia under one kingdom, and begs the question, what if Spain and Portugal united? Now, even though Miguel is heir to Portugal, he is also the heir to Spain, which in this era is a disparate series of kingdoms held together by marriage and sword as much as law. The result is likely that Miguel spends most of his youth growing up in the crown of Castile. This means that his marriage, and likely his personal foreign policy, will be tied into the anti-French web of Habsburg and English alliances that the Catholic monarchs attempted to build. Mary of England seems a possibility. Granted, in real life, she was married off to a French king old enough to be her dad, but, I'm ignoring that. Regardless, Miguel spent his youth traveling between the Spanish and Portuguese regions of his eventual domain, but because Spain is the most prestigious and powerful, it's likely a 60-40 split. Though to be fair, he probably spends more time in Portugal than in Aragon. Regardless, Miguel inherits Castile first, at least assuming his grandparents and father have more or less their real-life reigns and passing. But what exactly is he inheriting? Well, by 1521, Portugal has begun its true imperial conquests, discovering Brazil, conquering Goa and Ormuz in India and Persia respectively, and in general becoming so fabulously wealthy that you can almost forget about the slavery. Almost. Cortez had just conquered Mexico, and the Caribbean is dotted with the start of sugar plantations. And Aragon, while the least transoceanic, is far from weak. It controls eastern Iberia as well as the Italian land of Sardinia. However, that's not all. Grandpa Ferdinand also leaves Miguel his titles of King in Sicily and King of Naples, which is actually also the Kingdom of Sicily, but don't worry about it. So, Miguel is basically king of the Western Mediterranean, while his sister Joanna's marriage to Philip the Handsome, yes, I promise that's the real nickname, ensures a strong alliance with the Burgundian lands, although they never do come under the Iberian domain in this timeline. Now let's talk foreign policy, since the map painting is everyone's favorite part. This kingdom of Iberia likely does continue the conflicts with France that our world Spain did, since French expansion into Italy remains problematic. In addition, they are allied to the Habsburgs. Spain actually won these wars for the most part, and considering that the Ibero-Habsburg alliance is similarly powerful to the domains of Charles V, I think they pull that off here as well. However, Francis I of France's main quarrel would be with Charles V, who would likely still inherit the Burgundian lands and the Austrian imperial lands in Germany. While this empire is smaller than his real-life domains, they're also much more compact and centralized, meaning that he arguably benefits from this, though the Dutch might still revolt when the Habsburgs become more anti-Protestant. In the colonial front, things get a little tricky. See, while the Treaty of Tordesillas delineated what lands belong to the Crown of Castile and to the Crown of Portugal respectively, with Miguel being the king of both, the lines are probably very blurred. Plus, while Brazil fell in the Portuguese line, they didn't really care at this point. While they discovered it in the 1520s, shortly before Miguel was set to inherit it, they didn't really start colonizing South America until the 1530s. Here, with Portugal controlling the coasts of Angola and Spain having colonies in the Caribbean, hey, I didn't realize this until I was editing, but Portugal didn't actually start colonizing Angola until the 1570s, so that is entirely incorrect. However, the rest of the scenario kind of depends on the conclusions I drew from that, so we're just gonna pretend I didn't massively fuck up basic research here. This world's united Iberia could wind up with only token settlements in Brazil. While they would still be there just due to geography, it would be a footnote in the grand scheme of their empire, which, interestingly, could see France get involved in the area. Francis I was very keen to push into South America and attempted to do so numerous times. As a result, if he wins the right battles against Iberia, he could kinda just take it in the treaty. Or they get lucky and French moves in Brazil just work better against an even more neglected colony. Now, I somewhat think that the Spanish portion of the empire will evolve in a more similar fashion to our timeline than the Portuguese. The Spanish Empire's core was always Mexico and the Andes, and they had that territory before Miguel took over. Portugal, on the other hand, never really had that defining region. While they dominated the East Indian trade from Mozambique to Malacca, they did so through a number of trading ports and naval fortifications, not so much one giant conquest. Their king at this point in real life, João III, had to make numerous pragmatic calls about what to fortify and what to abandon, and Miguel isn't sure to make the same calculations. Nor is he sure to need to, since he can use the might of the Spanish fleet and all that Mexican silver to make more proactive measures. The 1530s are definitely a little early for the Europeans to be directly carving large colonies in Asia, but little nibbles here and there during times of uncertainty are possible. As a result, an aggressive Portugal with its pre-established trade and access to the Spanish Navy and silver for mercenaries could be a dangerous enemy, and a dangerous ally too, if we're being honest with ourselves here. But Iberia would not be invincible. Firstly, it is still less populated than France, and does lack the Dutch territory for the boost to its manpower. and, modern economic theories. Secondly, they would likely inherit the conflict with the Ottoman Empire that both Spain and Portugal were involved with, which would be very expensive. While this coalition was able to stop Ottoman expansion in real life, the Battle of Lepanto in the 1570s was still a massive dent in the Spanish Empire's treasury. Now, most of the problems that Spain had from the 1530s to the 1580s were very much personal and due to the complex dynamic between them and Habsburg Austria. However, one thing is likely certain. If England becomes Protestant, which it likely would, then relations between the two states would go down the drain. Both due to general Catholic zeal of European monarchies at the time, except the Protestant ones, but also due to the intermarriage of the Iberian and English lines. Remember, Miguel married an English princess, meaning that his son does have a claim to the English throne, especially if he marries another English noble. Don't think about that too hard, though. Regardless, such a turn of events may well see an armada or three, but while the English aren't likely to get another lucky storm, the fact is that such an invasion could be very expensive and potentially still be repulsed. And if the English get lucky with their counter-operations, that could be very bad. Enemies, and we need to be very careful. England and France would also be problems in the Americas. In the case of England, geography basically determines at least some of their colonies will be in North America, while France probably controls Brazil. Now, how much England is a problem depends on how interested Iberia is in North America. However, France is going to be a big fucking problem. While in real life Portugal neglected Brazil until the French and Dutch started sizing it up, here they were too late, and by the 1570s, France would have several major settlements. While the French wouldn't be the most eager colonizers, they would be some very eager slavers, and the colony would be horrifically profitable as a result. Why am I so sure? Because that's exactly what happened in French Haiti. Taken in 1697, Saint Dominique would become one of the richest colonies in the New World, the wealthiest in the French Empire, yes, more than their pieces of India at the time, off the back of the slave labor that made it all possible. One of, if not the most brutal colonial regimes of the era, it would only come crashing down during the French Revolution. Now make Haiti the size of the continental United States. Yeah, once France gets into the slave trade, they will quickly realize just how much blood money there is in Brazil. It's going to be utterly insane. Now, frankly, I don't even have to use Haiti as a comparison point, because colonial Brazil was also really fucking bad. For the first 250 years of European settlement in Brazil, from 1530 to 1780, over 70% of the so-called settlers to Brazil were slaves. In the 1600s, about 560,000 people would be enslaved and brought over to Brazil. France might import marginally less than that, but that's more due to the fact that they don't have the presence that the Portuguese did in Africa. I fully expect France will be very keen in West Africa, and might even colonize the Cape, which is much more hospitable to European colonialism than the rest of the continent at the time, and would allow them a wider area to commit crimes against humanity. I feel like I went on a tangent. Oh yeah, all the slavery in Brazil likely makes France obscenely wealthy. If this system is anywhere near as lucrative as its counterparts in either our world's Brazil or Haiti were, this France will be rolling in coffee and sugar. It would likely create the same effects as in other slave societies where the actual poor whites of the colony will struggle and there will be a shortage of skilled labor in the future, but it will create a class of planter aristocracy. In a very, very fucked up sense, however, I think that the slave traders and the merchants who bring the actual goods to Europe will create a much more viable French middle class, which could weaken feudalism in the metropole, mostly by moving it somewhere else and making it so much worse. In terms of England, I don't think that they're actually going to be that big a problem for Iberia and North America. Iberia gets most of what it wants from Mexico, Peru, and New Granada, with little interest elsewhere. While England can threaten the Caribbean islands and Iberia does care about those, they aren't going to make or break the empire. And honestly, France isn't even England's main rival in the New World either. It seems entirely plausible to me that that ends up being the Dutch. Their revolt is still likely to happen even if Spain doesn't take over from the Burgundians and it instead goes right to Austria. If the land goes to someone like Ferdinand I of the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V's brother, to whom he abdicated, then Ferdinand's centralization in support of Catholic orthodoxy will stoke rebellion like it did in Bohemia. And if the empire goes to someone like Philip II, then his support of Catholic orthodoxy and royal power will stoke rebellion like the Dutch Republic. Regardless, the Dutch do their thing and rebel. While New Holland is still likely a bust, the Mississippi River isn't, since they aren't in an eternal war with Iberia in this timeline. Just sporadic fighting due to the same tensions that the rest of Europe has with Iberia, and Iberia being friends with the Empire. Now, the Dutch Republic is still much less populated than the Kingdom of England, limiting their settlement population. However, I imagine that a lot of the other Protestant Germans, or even French Protestants, might be willing to move to Dutch America if the colony lasts long enough. Probably not enough to actually keep the colony from falling to the English eventually, but it would likely retain a distinctive flavor compared to the other American colonies. Either way, the Dutch West India Company likely tries to control settlement along the Mississippi River, since as a trading company, they generally aren't going to be too interested in spreading their colonization inland. However, as more farmers come in and slave plantations prove their value, the colony will gradually spread up north. I'm not necessarily sure how far, though. They might claim the entire Mississippi Basin and Mobile Bay, but by the 1730s, I imagine central company rule will still be restricted to the northern boundary of the state of Louisiana. Sorry for the very quick interruption, but if you're enjoying the video, please consider a like and subscribe. It really helps the channel, and I do want to see this community continue to grow. As we come to the 30 Years' War or equivalent, things get a little tricky. Being that the Iberians are still allied with the Habsburgs, I don't think that the alliance network is that different, all things considered. However, the question of how much the 80 Years' War, aka the Dutch Revolt, actually hampered Spain does come up. In addition, the Dutch Revolt is now against Habsburg Austria. While I've largely assumed that they'd still hold out, and I stand by that, this would be harder for them since Austria can still project power across Germany as the Holy Roman Emperor. The problem is more that the empire was still disintegrating, and if the Dutch are able to hold out at all, then Austria needs to deal with the hostile logistics continuously. Add in potential French support, and it's not that hard to see why the Dutch survive in my opinion. Regardless, for the wider 30 Years' War, I do think that the conflict probably goes in a similar fashion to our timeline, effectively ending the HRE as a cohesive state and seriously weakening the Iberian economy. Now, the problem with predicting the future of the Iberian monarchy at this point, and indeed most European powers, is that they were in this awkward middle ground between nearly entirely personal monarchies with limited ability to actually control the course of their colonial empires, and more state-driven, collective regimes that had centralized bureaucracies to manage the overseas possessions. In our world, the Spanish Empire entered a phase of very personal conflict, such as the 80 Years' War, the 30 Years' War inside the former, and the War of Spanish Succession. In addition, late Habsburg Spain saw a period of high inflation due to all the Mexican and Peruvian silver, as well as administrative bloat and intense court factionalism. How much of that carries over to the Avis Kingdom of Iberia? Royal marriages and court politics are entirely changed by this point. Again, our point of divergence is in the 1490s, and now we're talking about the 1680s to 1700s. That being said, I do think that the bureaucracy would become more bloated and inefficient as the state grows, just in a different way than in our timeline. We can't really copy the Portuguese stagnation onto Iberia either. Portugal fell from king of the world to B-lister largely due to the Iberian Union, the real-life personal union of Imperial Spain and Portugal, which dragged Portugal into all of Spain's very expensive wars. Portugal had previously been rather adept diplomatically, and it needed to be if it wanted to stay independent of Spain. However, when it failed and a childless king died, they were brought into the Spanish fold and had pieces of their empire stripped away or pawned off during the process of restoring their own native monarchy. A similar process would happen to Spain about a century later, but again, wars of succession are too personal to bring over to this timeline. That being said, there's certainly one problem that most Iberian monarchs would want to fix, especially by the 1700s. See, up until 1716, Spain wasn't one unified country like France. It was a massive personal union like England and Scotland. By the 1700s of this world, Iberia would be a patchwork of Portugal as well as the crowns of Castile and Aragon, each of which contained a number of kingdoms like Galicia and Leon. This wasn't too big a deal in the preceding 15 to 1600s, when there were still feudal interactions and peasant levies did most of the fighting, but as the era of modern states and professional armies arises, this will become more and more of a problem, especially for a king who controls regions like Mexico, Peru, Mozambique, and very possibly decent bites out of Indonesia. Oh, and for good measure, Spain also tried to conquer the Khmer Empire and failed. Basically, having all of this under multiple kingdoms is just creating unnecessary administrative and mercantile bloat that weakens the king, and most of them would want to centralize power in this era. But you know who wouldn't want that power centralized? The nobility. Now, in terms of pure rationalization, the places most opposed to this move would be Italy, Aragon, and places away from the core of royal power, Asturias and Navarra or northern Portugal. I could easily see this becoming a civil war, one that lasts decades if we consider the English Civil War over royal power. And when you think about it, the 30 Years' War is basically a civil war on the German scale. Regardless, the Iberian Civil War is probably one of those conflicts with a million names. War of the Cortes, War of the Crowns, Unification War, etc. I think that the monarchy has a decent shot of winning, but in that chaos, Italy might slip away. Not necessarily out of a sense of nationalism, but because it's across the sea and far from the fighting, as well as being opposed to the centralization and taxes. Iberia would have to go about reconquering it, and the region could wind up a potential weak link that enemies would want to exploit. The European balance of power wars in the 1700s are very much unpredictable. The odds of the Habsburg-Iberian alliance lasting 200 contiguous years are incredibly slim, especially if Italy seems to be up for grabs. Not to mention, the dynastic links between Avis Iberia and the Habsburg Austrians are likely to weaken or at least wax and wane. Either way, to figure out the main coalitions of the 1700s, we need to figure out the state of Europe and the colonial affairs. Austria and France are probably about as strong in Europe as normal, but are missing any pieces of the Spanish Empire they got after the War of Spanish Succession. However, the colonial theater is incredibly different, with North America becoming a front of the Anglo-Dutch conflicts rather than the Anglo-French. French-Brazil making France oodles and oodles of blood money, and Iberia remaining stronger in Indonesia and possibly India. In fact, India is likely a right old mess as France, Britain, Iberia, and the Netherlands compete within themselves and with natives, though the Dutch are by far the weakest party. This map is more or less arbitrary, though I focused on the west for Iberia due to it growing out of Goa. However, the Iberians probably have better luck in Indonesia since the islands make it more fragmentary and there's less competition with other Europeans. That being said, I think their economy would begin to stagnate behind the English and French as the empire grows to the point of diminishing returns and the erosion of trade monopolies as other powers get involved. Regardless, the 1720s likely see something like England and Iberia versus France and a small coalition of Italians, a more viable coalition of Indian states, and maybe even Austria. Now, the actual state of this is nearly unpredictable, but I feel like I've been pretty hard on Iberia, so I'll let them have this one. The problem, of course, is how utterly expensive this war would be, and the empire likely enters a period of economic stagnation without serious and expensive reform. Iberia would likely try, but much like England's transition to a more parliamentary government and proto-capitalist economy throughout this period, or France doubling down on absolutism while it could, the reforms would be messy. After all, the Bourbons took over and immediately implemented a series of centralization and mercantilist reforms that increased Madrid's control over the colonies and strengthened their ties to the metropole. It then proceeded to make the empire poorer, as suddenly they couldn't tax the now illegal trade with other powers. In addition, England got lucky with Parliament's economic views and the Glorious Revolution, and France got lucky with Louis XIV. Less lucky with his succession, though, I will admit. By an alternate 1740s, Iberia is an utterly massive empire, but it is likely still struggling. While the victory over the French allowed them to take bites out of Brazil and other parts of the French colonial domain, I think that inflation and diminishing returns would be biting them on the ass hard. They either stay out of the next Franco-British War, or they only get dragged in later, possibly on France's side due to the English dominance in India, threatening the Iberian East Indies. With English colonies now a threat to Florida and even Cuba, the question now becomes how much Iberia can afford to let England run rampant when the Caribbean colonies are some of the most profitable in America, for all the vile reasons you've come to expect by now. However, if Iberia gets involved in this war, I think it would likely be a defeat, possibly with France throwing them under the bus to keep their own territory, the loss of India or Indonesia to England, Florida likely going to British America, etc. Hell, England took Majorca and Gibraltar in the War of Spanish Succession, then pushing for Mediterranean land off Iberia isn't out of the question either. Now, I don't want to copy French history onto Iberia in this world, but at the same time, Iberia just lost an expensive war to a power that has proven a serious threat, but is now broke. If the American colonies revolt, I think Iberia is in a position that will tempt them to support the Patriots. However, if France doesn't get involved while Iberia does, then suddenly their economy is even more fucked up. The need for reform and economic modernization will arise just like it did in France, and things will get messy. However, the Iberian Revolution is unlikely to become as devastating as the French Revolution did. Iberia is not going to be able to conquer France and push into the rest of Europe, and Italian campaigns will likely get bogged down in marching up from Naples. The result is likely that liberal ideas are stunted in the continent as a whole, but honestly the whole region is so different politically that I'm not sure what happens. After all, maybe France went parliamentary while Charles won the English Civil War, and now the whole world is backwards. Actually, with their colonial empire strengthening merchants so much more, that kind of makes sense for France. Regardless, an Iberian Revolution only brings more unrest and instability in their empire. Now, when I talked about this in my video about the Brits winning the American Revolution, a few people pointed out that Mexico likely wouldn't be the first to revolt, mainly wanting autonomy. Knowing that, and considering the state of Iberia is so utterly different to Spain or Portugal at this point, I won't make any predictions on the state of the New World, but I do get the feeling that the 1780s to 1820s will see Iberia's grip on the American colonies loosen very quickly. However, with that, I think I need to end the scenario here. With the survival of Miguel da Paz, Iberia has been united under one state in the Avis dynasty for over 200 years and conquered the world. However, the sheer expense of that empire, as well as its bloated economy, have caused malaise and decline that necessitated reform. Reform that came too little too late, and the country only lost colony after colony betrayed by their allies. This culminated in a revolution against the old order, which, while breaking that monarchical order, has likely only seen greater challenges laid out for the empire going forward. France has grown decadent and wealthy off its ill-gotten gains in Brazil, while the British have seized Indonesia from Iberia, and the New World has begun drifting away. Thank you so much for watching, and have a great day.